นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening. This weekend we've arranged an ordination, temporary ordination of novice monks, which will take place tomorrow. And it's always, these occasions are always a reminder or a cause for us to think more deeply about why people become Buddhist monks, nuns, novices, why people come to live in monasteries, take on the rules of discipline that we call the Vinaya, live in quiet places like this, in the forest. Why do people do that? Well, since the time of the Buddha, his teachings have pointed out the value of living in a disciplined way in quiet places dedicated to cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path, the practice of sila, samadhi, and panya. As we know, the lay life is not always so conducive to the practice of Dhamma. Sometimes the people around us are not practicing or Buddhist, or they're not fully aware of the Buddhist teachings or practicing according to them. That's already one obstacle, you might say, that we have to negotiate in lay life. And even ourselves, if we have faith and an interest to follow the Buddhist teachings, but we're living in the world, we find that it's very easy to get distracted, lost, caught up in issues and activities that are not really the best for us or for others perhaps. We get prone to temptation. You live in the household life, you've got money in your pocket, hopefully, and you've got a fridge full of food and a computer or a phone full of data. And there's plenty to tempt you, distract you, confuse you, take your mind away from the Dhamma. And then even if you try and keep quite a disciplined life, maybe commit to the 5 precepts and practice meditation on a regular basis, listen to Dhamma, attend Buddhist temples, monasteries, centers. There's still endless obstacles as we try to practice. So, since the time of the Buddha, people have come out to live in monasteries, and particularly in quiet places, in the countryside, in the forest, because it's conducive to training the mind and getting a bit outside the hustle and bustle of the cities and towns. But it's not always easy, because if you come to live in a quiet forest place, you have to renounce, and the word is nekama. You have to give up some of the conveniences and pleasures of lay life. You don't get everything that you want when you live in a forest or in a monastery. You get some things that you like and want, but not everything, and you'll see that very clearly and very quickly. You don't have this, you don't have that, you want this, you want that, and you don't have it. You get enough to get by. You get the 4 requisites, so you have clothing, your robes, you have your food, 1 meal a day, whatever people are kind enough to share with us. We have medicines for when we're sick, we have a kuti, a meditation hut in the forest. So we have enough, but it's simple, not many distractions, and that can be quite challenging for our mind that's used to distraction and seeking distraction all the time. Socializing, technology, work, all the things we do to keep our mind occupied, a lot of them drop away when you come into a monastery. So this is what we call the practice of nekkhamma, letting go of the home life and the lay life to come and live in a monastery. But to make that step, people must see the value of it. See the value of the heightened training and discipline, commitment to the practice. See the value of living in a quiet place, even if there is less material wealth and comfort compared with home. There's other benefits that one gets. And when you see that, then you want to try it. Maybe you know you have some weaknesses that when you're at home you're always following and giving into those weaknesses. So you want to get out of your usual patterns and habits and place of residence so that you can work with yourself. So this gives rise to ordination. When I think of ordination, I often go back to thinking of the life of Maha Kassapa, one of the Buddha's leading disciples, most famous disciples. Because he had a very beautiful ordination and lay life. Before he was a monk, he was a farmer, but a wealthy farmer from a wealthy family, well-to-do family. So he had good future ahead of him as a layperson. And of course his parents wanted him to be a householder, get married, have kids, do the usual things, make money, make them happy. But he had a much deeper calling, a deeper, more profound insight into the suffering of life. And he had faith in what you might call Dhamma practice or spiritual practice. He didn't see worldly happiness as very satisfying. The wealth, the comfort, the success he could have as a layperson, he wasn't impressed or even looking forward to it, because he knew it came with a lot of responsibility and confusion and trouble. His parents tried to get him a wife, as they did in those days, and he didn't want to get married. He was thinking more of going off to the forest to train as what we call a samana, somebody dependent on alms, so a beggar, and living in a peaceful way, dedicated to practicing for nibbana. That was his goal, even as a layperson. So when he did become married, he had some good fortune, maybe from past life, good karma. His wife thought much the same as him, and she also didn't want to have the family life, the household life. She wanted to go off and meditate and find a teacher just the same as him. So they were equal in faith and their aspiration for enlightenment. So they didn't, once they were married, go the normal way. They slept separately, even though they were in the same room. They made a fence of flowers and said at night, nobody's crossing this fence, and they both agreed to that. So they lived together but separately until the time was right for them to leave, give away their possessions, sort out their family affairs, and then they headed off. And even then they realized they're not going to be able to go off to find a teacher together, because they're partners, their husband and wife, and their previous love and attachment for each other will only get in the way, so they separated at a crossroads. One went left, one went right, with the idea of finding their own teacher. And Maha Kassapa went walking through the forest, and of course the Buddha, with his great psychic powers and knowledge, was aware that Maha Kassapa was destined to become one of his leading disciples. He had lots of good barami and karma from a past life. So the Buddha went out to meet him. You might say to honor his good intention and his good karma, his good barami. The Buddha walked 5 miles and went and sat under a tree waiting for Maha Kassapa, because he knew he was coming down the pathway. And as soon as Maha Kassapa saw the Buddha, he saw the aura of the Buddha. This is one of the things the Buddha can do. He can spread his rainbow aura, which is not like anyone else's aura. So it's like, for those people who maybe already meditate, already are quite sensitive, immediately on seeing the Buddha and his aura, his very bright, radiant rainbow aura, like Maha Kassapa knew this is an enlightened teacher. That's something beyond words. He didn't have to sit down and discuss the Dhamma and work it out through a conversation, or go to the Buddha's place and see how he taught and how he practiced. He had this very sharp, intuitive awareness that this is an enlightened person. This is what they're like. Maybe it's the feeling of peace, the radiant aura that he saw. And of course later, hearing the Buddha teach, there was confirmation that the Buddha is wise and enlightened through his teachings. But that came later. So Maha Kassapa bowed to the Buddha, who was sitting under a tree, and offered himself as a student. Can I be your student? And he made a vow, because he knew he'd be coming into a group of monks, because already the Buddha had a Sangha, a group of monks, a community. And Maha Kassapa was aware that you live in a community, it's always going to be challenging, just like a family or a workplace. So one of his first resolutions was that coming into the Sangha, he made a resolution that he would maintain his hiri-ottappa towards all the other monks who were students of the Buddha in the community. Towards the senior ones, the middling ones, the junior ones, he'd maintain hiri-ottappa. These terms, hiri and ottappa, mean sense of shame and an awareness of the consequences of unskillful action that combine to give you a conscience, so you don't want to say or do things that hurt yourself or hurt others. So when you maintain hiri-ottappa, you naturally have a sense of respect, sensitivity to other people. Even if inside you still have some mental defilements, some anger, some jealousy. And Maha Kassapa was very wise. He realized that would come up already. Perhaps he'd already been meditating and knew his own mind. So he wanted to preempt that, make sure that he didn't fall into jealousy, rivalry, competitiveness when he entered the Sangha. So I made this vow, this resolution. I'm going to maintain hiri-ottappa with everyone. The most junior, the most senior, everyone. And the Buddha praised him, said this is a really good attitude to have when you live in a community. The second one was that he said, whatever teachings I receive, because Maha Kassapa is not enlightened yet, and that's what he's seeking. He wants the end of suffering, nibbana, enlightenment. Whatever teaching he received, he said, I'm going to take it away and contemplate it respectfully. Give it respect, give it importance and value, and use it to learn and further my practice. Which again the Buddha praised. He said this is the right attitude for when you come into the Sangha. As a novice, as a monk, you're here to learn, so you have to set aside some of your pride, your conceit, that voice that says, I know it all. Which out in the world you're not always doing, because part of the worldly life is to try and impress other people with what you know, who you are, your wealth, your power, your fame, all the things that people crave and seek in worldly life, ordinary life. You come into the Sangha as a monastic, you're setting that aside. And you're saying, I'm here to learn, so whatever teachings I receive, I'm going to have to bring them on board and learn and really realize these teachings, not just quote them or remember them only, but also to actually practice with them until I see for myself. The third resolution was, he said, I'm going to contemplate this body, establish mindfulness in this body, what we call Kaya Gata Sati, with gladness, which is an important aside note, because contemplating your own physical body, the four elements, the posture, the 32 parts of the body, the breath, it's not always particularly enjoyable or attractive meditation subject. One part of contemplating the body is you're becoming aware of the unattractive side of the body, the impermanence of the body. We get older every day, one day we've got to die. And you're seeing the body as not self, as elements rather than as a person, a being, because that's a delusion. So it's a very important thing to ground oneself in, and he already realized that. So this is his innate wisdom coming out. He said, I'm going to ground myself in contemplation of the body and find happiness, gladness doing that. So he has to find the gladness, the happiness as he meditates on the body, which gives you a kind of idea of what your aim is. Because contemplating the body can make you a little bit depressed, fed up. You come from the lay life where it's all about pleasure, beautiful things, beautiful people, nice possessions, the latest, the best, the shiniest, the brightest, the most expensive. Generally that's the way the world goes, isn't it? We want the best sounds, the best sights, tastes, food. You want the best food, the newest food, the most interesting food that suits you, and so on. But when you ground yourself in the body, you're finding happiness in contemplating the way material form is as it is, starting with your own physical body. So Maha Kassapa got it right, and that's why he got enlightened within 7 days. People are always saying, oh, why can't I get enlightened in 7 days, like Maha Kassapa or some of the other famous monks and nuns. And well, you have to do this, don't you? Establish hiriyottapa, conscience, so you don't do or say evil things. Then listen to the Dhamma that you're taught, contemplate it, learn from it, and then ground yourself in contemplating the body until you see the body as not self. This body we have right here, this body that's full of mucus because I've got a cold today, it's not self. You have a cold, but it's not self. Whatever feelings you get from your illness are not self. This is how Maha Kassapa practiced. He's also a very kind person. He's often remembered as a stern teacher, very ascetic. He had very few possessions, and he went wandering in very poor areas and always went to the houses of the poorest people. So he got really minimal food and poor quality food. That was his character. That's how he trained. But he was also very kind. And he walked on with the Buddha once he had declared himself as a student. And after walking for a while, the Buddha got tired. So he sat down and said, I'm going to take a rest. And Maha Kassapa is already devoted to the Buddha, taking on the role as a disciple, a student of the Buddha. So he rushed to put his own outer robe. We have three robes as a monk. We have our main jivara underneath, and then we have a second robe which is on my shoulder now. It's what we call a sangati, or outer robe. He folded his sangati and put it down for the Buddha to sit on under a tree, rather than let the Buddha sit on the ground. If you ever are out in the forest here, you'll notice you sit on the ground, there's always ants at the very least. Ants, other kinds of insects, flies, mosquitoes, there's snakes sometimes, all kinds of things. So Maha Kassapa, out of respect, love for his teacher, he put down his own robe, folded it and made a seat for the Buddha. And later, out of respect for, sort of mutual respect the Buddha had for Maha Kassapa, he actually exchanged his robe. Maha Kassapa said, I've got these robes, your robes are looking very old and tatty and worn. Because the Buddha wore what we call bangsakula cloth. When we have a papa and we offer an old piece of cloth or a new piece of cloth to the monks, it's what we call bangsakula cloth. And sometimes it's very old, or cloth from a corpse, or discarded rubbish cloth. It's what we call bangsakula. So the Buddha wore bangsakula cloth. So his robes were not very good looking, we believe. Maybe patched, stained, old, weary looking robes. So Maha Kassapa offered to swap. So perhaps the Buddha and Maha Kassapa were of similar size. They say the Buddha was quite tall for the Aryan people of northern India, and Maha Kassapa was. So they swapped robes. And the Buddha didn't normally do that. A lot of people probably wanted to do that. A lot of monks would have liked to swap their robe with the Buddha, but they didn't. He wouldn't let them. But Maha Kassapa, he honoured him by doing that. And there was a number of things he honoured Maha Kassapa with like that. Gave him special acknowledgement sometimes. And the belief is perhaps because Maha Kassapa outlived the Buddha. Most people think of the leading disciples of the Buddha as Sariputta and Moggallana. So on our shrine here we have two standing figures. One is Sariputta, who was considered very wise, able to explain and analyze the Dhamma well. The other statue is Moggallana, who had great samadhi and psychic powers. But they both died before the Buddha. They didn't live as long as the Buddha. So Maha Kassapa did. He outlived the Buddha, and even though the Buddha didn't appoint him as leader of the Sangha, you get the impression he was kind of one of the sort of informally acknowledged leaders in the Sangha after the Buddha. So the Buddha gave him a number of privileges and praised him, and he played a very important role in the Sangha. And particularly for us as forest monks, Maha Kassapa is seen as the father of the forest monk tradition, or what we call the Gammatana tradition. Monks taking a meditation object, living out in the forest, eating simple food in their bowl, living very simply, meditating, doing a lot of sitting, walking meditation. What we call the Gammatana tradition that Ajahn Chah, our teacher, was part of, and Ajahn Mun, his teacher, was part of. We all look to Maha Kassapa as kind of the father or the beginning of that tradition. He lived a very disciplined, ascetic life. As I said, he was considered quite stern, even though he was quite compassionate. But he wasn't angry. He's an enlightened arahant, so he wasn't angry, but he was very direct in the way he taught. And occasionally he had a few run-ins with some monks who were not very dedicated to the practice. And there's a few times the Buddha actually asked him to teach the monks because most of the monks respected him and listened to him. But there was one group of monks, you might call them a bit naughty or a bit full of themselves, proud, conceited. And Maha Kassapa didn't want to teach them. He said, "Oh, waste of time. These guys are not going to listen." Because these monks were actually very smooth talkers. They could give good Dhamma talks, impress people. Probably be, if they were here today, they'd be on YouTube for sure. Be popular. But they weren't keeping all the rules. They weren't practicing as hard as they could. They weren't yet enlightened. And Maha Kassapa said to the Buddha, "What's the point? They're not going to listen." And the Buddha said, No, you've got to go." Which is very much in the tradition of Ajahn Chah. Send the monks off to teach some group. The monk is reluctant, but Ajahn Chah used to say, no, you go and teach them. You teach them, you teach yourself. Maha Kassapa was the same, and he actually managed to bring them around to realize their mistakes. So that was a very good thing. And that happened on a number of occasions. He was quite good at getting monks who had strayed from the path back on the path. It's one of the roles he played. So he was what we call an elder, and very much respected in the Sangha, looked up to, and to this day, followed his example is followed. So when we have an ordination, I often think of Maha Kassapa as a good example to take for a new monk or novice, because he's got the basics right. He knows that you have to follow the rules whether you like it or not. You have to have a conscience, and you're training yourself to give up evil, cultivate good. You take the practice seriously, so you value the teachings you get, you really use them, practice with them, and you ground yourself in mindfulness of the body, because that's the beginning of Satipatthana and the realization of the Four Noble Truths, which bring us to enlightenment. There's no way around it. You have to contemplate this body to see it as impermanent, suffering, not self. It's not always a popular practice, as I was saying earlier. We sometimes prefer to contemplate the mind. So most people are sort of come with their questions. What is the mind? What is consciousness? I want to practice mind, watching mind, letting go of all kinds of unwholesome mental states. And that is part of the practice, of course. But we also have to contemplate the body. And some practitioners attain samadhi and they don't have to really feel or notice the suffering or the heaviness of their body, because they have this light, happy state of meditation. So they often sidestep or miss out on the contemplation of the body. And it's something that teachers like Ajahn Chah, Lumpong Man or Maha Kassapa would constantly remind the monks, come back to watching the body, contemplating the body. You can't escape it. Another monk in the modern era who reminds us of Maha Kassapa is Ajahn Mahabua. Another Maha. The word Maha means great. And nowadays it's applied to somebody who studies the Pali texts and passes exams. They become a Maha. Ajahn Mahabua, reminiscent of Maha Kassapa, taught the very same way, similar way, very direct, but a very good, peaceful energy around him. And like Ajahn Chah, when you lived in his monastery, I remember, really peaceful, bright energy. Before you've even done anything or said anything or heard any teaching, you're already aware of this energy. A bit like when Maha Kassapa encountered the Buddha, and the Buddha has this radiant energy around him, this aura, which Maha Kassapa immediately picked up on. Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Mahabua are very similar. You go to their monastery, already you feel good. Even if you came into the monastery feeling bad, very quickly you feel good. A lot of your stressful thoughts seem to fade out. A lot of your tiredness and The heaviness of the body or even illness seems to disappear. And you get a real boost. But they can't, teachers like that can't practice for you, but they do give you a boost. They give you this good example in what they say, they do, and then this good energy, very wholesome energy in their monasteries. So many monks like to go and visit them, stay with them, practice with them, particularly forest monks. That's one thing you get when you practice renunciation. You're giving up the brightness of TV screens, computer screens, phones, refrigerators, aircon systems, whatever it is that you look for as your kind of refuge in the lay life. You come into the forest, you're giving that up, but you get something in return. It may be more subtle, and it may be a kind of brightness of mind that you don't immediately feel, or it's not immediately tangible to you. But if you keep practicing, you will notice it, and you'll surely notice it when you leave. So if you're a temporary 8 preceptor or a temporary novice or a temporary monk, when you leave, you'll notice things sort of gradually fade, and it's like you go back home and to work and family, and you're probably quite happy to relax. Don't have to follow all those rules, but some of that bright, radiant energy fades as well. So you lose that. Then you realize the benefit of renunciation, living in the forest, meditating, practicing the monk's life. Of course, you can still practice as a layperson, and that's what you learn. In the monastery, you learn how to be a good layperson, a skillful practitioner, even if you can't stay forever. You go back home, maybe you can keep up regular meditation, live a bit more simply, eat a bit less, spend a bit less money, don't need quite so many apps on your phone, all the things that you fiddle around with and spend time with distracting yourself, maybe you can do with less of them. It's one of the benefits you get from living in the monastery. This is something to contemplate. Why do I come to live in a monastery? Why do I ordain? What's it for? What's the purpose? But also consider, what are the obstacles and how will I deal with the obstacles? And the Buddha said that the best quality for dealing with all obstacles in the beginning certainly is patience, endurance. When you haven't yet got the wisdom to overcome your suffering, you have to be patient. But from patience, observing, establishing mindfulness, you learn. Then the wisdom comes, and wisdom is that way of looking at things, that understanding, that insight that helps you to let go of the causes of suffering. Changes your thinking, helps you to let go of greed, anger, delusion, whatever it is that's causing you trouble. But have the patience to get to the point where wisdom starts to arise. It'd be nice to be Maha Kassapa and enlightened in 7 days, and then if you're here for a few weeks, then the rest of the time is just bliss, isn't it? But maybe you have to be a bit more patient and just keep working towards it. And whether it's 7 days, 7 years, 7 lifetimes, don't worry too much about the time. Just keep going, and sooner or later the wisdom will come. So I wish you much wisdom, much patience, and success in your practice.